At 60 years old, Keanu Reeves is one of the biggest action stars on the planet. The man who stopped bullets in The Matrix, who avenged a dog in John Wick, who dominated cinema for 3 decades. But there's something nobody told you about him. While most Hollywood stars accumulate mansions, yachts, and scandals, Keanu rides the subway. While others flaunt wealth, he donates millions in silence. While fame builds egos, he became known as the most humble man in the industry. But this humility wasn't born from success. It was forged in tragedy. Because behind the hero we all know exists a man who buried his newborn daughter, who lost the love of his life in a brutal accident, who watched his best friend die at 23, who was abandoned by his father before he could even form memories. How does someone who lost nearly everything become the most generous person in Hollywood? Why does a man worth hundreds of millions prefer sitting on park benches sharing lunch with strangers? What transforms unbearable pain into unshakable kindness? And more importantly, what's the real price of fame when everything you truly wanted wasn't for sale? To understand Keanu Reeves, we can't start with the movies. We need to start with the boy who never had a place to call home. Charles Reeves was born on September 2, 1964, in Beirut, Lebanon, a city already trembling on the edge of civil war. His mother, Patricia Taylor, was a British costume designer chasing creative work across continents. His father, Samuel Nolan Reeves Jr., was a Hawaiian-born geologist with a restless spirit and darker demons than anyone could have predicted. From the very beginning, Keanu's life was defined by instability. His parents' marriage crumbled before he could form memories of it. When Keanu was only 3 years old, Samuel walked out of their lives, abandoning his son and daughter Kim without explanation, without goodbye, without ever looking back. Years later, Keanu would say with quiet pain, "I don't have any memory of him. He left when I was so young that I don't even know what it feels like to have a father." That absence, small as it might seem to some, became a scar that never fully healed. A void shaped like the outline of a man who was supposed to be there, but never was. Patricia, left alone with 2 small children, did what she had to do. She packed their lives into suitcases and began a journey that would never quite end, from Beirut to Sydney, Australia. Then to New York City, where the lights were bright, but the apartments were small and the money always tight. Finally, to Toronto, Canada, where Keanu would spend most of his childhood, though home always felt like a temporary word. His mother worked relentlessly, costume designing for rock stars and theater productions, often gone for days, sometimes weeks. She married again, and again, and again. By the time Keanu reached his teenage years, he had lived with 4 different stepfathers, each one a stranger trying to fill a role that didn't belong to them. "I moved schools constantly," Keanu recalled. "I was always the new kid, always starting over, always trying to figure out where I fit." He attended 4 different high schools in 5 years: Etobicoke School of the Arts, De La Salle College, Avondale Secondary Alternative School, and finally, he never graduated from any of them. It wasn't rebellion that kept him moving. It was restlessness born of a deeper ache. A boy searching for stability in a life that offered none. A boy who didn't belong anywhere because nowhere had ever truly belonged to him. School was a battlefield. Keanu struggled with dyslexia, a condition that made reading feel like deciphering code, that turned every classroom into a reminder of what he couldn't do as easily as others. Teachers grew frustrated. Classmates moved ahead. And Keanu, bright but lost, fell further behind. "I was a decent student in some things, but I had trouble with words on a page," he admitted years later. "It made me feel stupid, even when I knew I wasn't." The shame of that, the quiet humiliation, stayed with him long after he left those classrooms behind. But there were two places where the world made sense: on the ice and on the stage. Hockey became his refuge. Gliding across frozen rinks, Keanu found something he had never known: freedom. He was fast, aggressive, fearless. His teammates called him the Wall because of his fierce goaltending. For a few hours each week, he wasn't the abandoned kid or the boy who couldn't read. He was simply a player, part of a team, wanted. And then there was acting. In school plays and community theater, Keanu discovered he could become someone else entirely. He could step into another life, another story, and for a brief, beautiful moment, escape the loneliness that shadowed his own. He later reflected, "Acting gave me a place to put all the feelings I didn't know how to express. It was the only place I felt I could be myself by pretending to be someone else." The irony was not lost on him. By 17, Keanu made a decision that would change everything. He dropped out of high school, walked away from the possibility of a conventional life, and chose the most uncertain path imaginable. He would become an actor. His mother didn't understand. His stepfather at the time dismissed it as a fantasy. Friends warned him he was throwing his future away. But Keanu had spent his entire childhood being told where to go, who to live with, how to fit in. For the first time, he was choosing his own direction. He took small roles in Canadian theater productions, in commercials for Coca-Cola, in forgettable TV movies. He waited tables, slept on couches, survived on dreams and stubbornness. The rejection was constant, the uncertainty exhausting. But he had lived with uncertainty his whole life. This time, at least, it was his choice. And so, the boy who had been abandoned, the boy who never graduated, the boy who moved through life like a ghost searching for a place to haunt, began the long, painful climb toward something that looked, from a distance, like a future. But the shadows of abandonment do not disappear with success. They follow. They linger. And for Keanu Reeves, the ache of not belonging, of being left behind, would shape not only his career, but every choice, every loss, every quiet act of kindness that would one day define him. The stage was set. The journey had begun, but the real tragedies were still waiting in the wings. At 22 years old, Keanu Reeves arrived in Los Angeles with nothing but a battered suitcase and a resume so thin it barely filled a single page. The city of dreams had swallowed thousands of hopefuls before him, chewing them up and spitting them back to wherever they came from. But Keanu had survived abandonment, instability, and constant rejection. Hollywood, he thought, couldn't be worse than what he'd already endured. He was wrong. The early years were merciless. Auditions where casting directors barely looked up from their clipboards. Callbacks that never came. Rent he couldn't afford in apartments he shared with strangers. He worked as a production assistant, fetching coffee and moving equipment, invisible once again in an industry obsessed with visibility. But then, in 1986, came a break. A small but haunting role in the film River's Edge, a dark drama about teenagers confronting the murder of one of their own. Keanu played a stoner kid, a character most would dismiss as forgettable. But there was something in his performance, a quiet intensity, a wounded authenticity that critics noticed. "There's a young actor named Keanu Reeves who you should watch," one reviewer wrote. It wasn't stardom, but it was a foothold. Then came 1989, and everything shifted with a film no one expected to succeed. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, a goofy, time-traveling comedy about two dim-witted high schoolers trying to pass a history exam. The script was ridiculous, the budget was tiny, but Keanu threw himself into the role of Ted Theodore Logan with an earnestness that made the absurd feel genuine. Be excellent to each other became more than a catchphrase. It became a philosophy that Keanu, whether he realized it or not, was already living. The film was a surprise hit, and suddenly, Keanu Reeves was a name people recognized. Offers came in, his face appeared on magazine covers. He was no longer invisible. But fame brought something unexpected. The weight of expectation and the fear of losing it all just as quickly as it had arrived. Hollywood was littered with actors who had one hit and then vanished. Keanu knew he had to prove he was more than just Ted Logan. He chose roles that challenged him. Point Break in 1991, where he played an undercover Federal Bureau of Investigation agent opposite Patrick Swayze, a role that demanded physicality and depth. He trained for months, learning to surf, performing his own stunts, pushing his body to its limits. The film became a cult classic, and Keanu's star continued to rise. But it was during these years that he formed one of the most important friendships of his life, one that would later become one of his deepest wounds, River Phoenix. They met on the set of I Love You to Death in 1990. River was already a Hollywood prodigy, a gifted actor with an old soul and a sensitivity that set him apart. Keanu saw in River something he recognized, a kindred spirit, someone who didn't quite fit the Hollywood mold, someone searching for meaning in an industry built on illusion. They became inseparable. Late-night conversations about acting, about life, about the strangeness of being young and famous and still feeling lost. River understood the loneliness Keanu carried, and Keanu understood the pressure River felt to be perfect. He was one of the most talented people I'd ever met, Keanu would later say, his voice barely above a whisper. And one of the most genuine. But even as Keanu's career climbed, shadows lingered. His father, Samuel, resurfaced briefly, not out of love or regret, but entangled in legal trouble involving drugs. The man who had abandoned Keanu decades earlier was now making headlines for all the wrong reasons, and the world wanted to know how Keanu felt about it. He said nothing publicly, but privately, the reopening of that old wound stung. The father, who was never there, was still managing to cause pain, even from a distance. And then, just as Keanu thought he had found solid ground, tragedy struck in a way that would shatter him. October 31st, 1993. River Phoenix collapsed outside the Viper Room nightclub on Sunset Boulevard. A drug overdose. Keanu wasn't there, but he got the call in the middle of the night. By the time he arrived at the hospital, River was already gone. He was 23 years old. Keanu stood in the sterile hallway, staring at nothing, unable to process what had just been stolen from the world. His friend, his brother, in all but blood, gone. He didn't speak about it publicly for years. When reporters asked, he would simply say, "I miss him." 3 words that carried the weight of an ocean. River's death left a scar that never truly healed, and it was only the beginning of the losses Keanu would endure. But in 1994, just months after burying his friend, Keanu was offered a role that would make him a global superstar. Speed, and the world would soon learn that even in the wreckage of grief, Keanu Reeves could still run. Speed and the Matrixin. June 1994. Speed exploded into theaters and changed everything. a bus rigged with a bomb that would detonate if it dropped below 50 miles per hour. Keanu played Jack Traven, an Los Angeles Police Department cop racing against time, against traffic, against death itself. It was relentless, breathless, and audiences couldn't look away. The film earned over $350 million worldwide, becoming one of the biggest action hits of the decade. Overnight, Keanu Reeves was no longer just a rising star. He was a leading man, a bankable action hero, a face that could open a film on name alone. Critics, who had once dismissed him as just the guy from Bill and Ted, now praised his intensity, his physicality, his ability to anchor a film with quiet charisma. He performed nearly all of his own stunts, trained with special weapons and tactics teams, and threw himself into the role with the same ferocity he had brought to hockey rinks as a teenager. But even as the world celebrated his success, Keanu carried Rivers' death like a stone in his chest. The premiere parties, the magazine covers, the interviews where everyone wanted to know what was next. None of it filled the silence left by his friend's absence. "I was grateful for the work," he admitted years later, "but I was also grieving, and no one really knew." He could have ridden the wave of speed into guaranteed blockbusters and easy paychecks. The studio wanted a sequel. Offers poured in for similar action roles, but Keanu had never been interested in the obvious path. Instead, he chose Shakespeare. He played Hamlet on stage in Manitoba, Canada, a decision that baffled Hollywood executives. "Why would you do theater in Canada when you could be making millions in LA?" they asked. His answer was simple: "Because I wanted to." He took on indie films, experimental projects, roles that challenged him even if they didn't pay well. He played a lawyer in The Devil's Advocate opposite Al Pacino. He starred in The Replacements, a football comedy that critics dismissed but audiences loved. And then, in 1999, came the role that would define a generation: The Matrix. The Wachowskis had written a script that most studios didn't understand. A story about reality being a simulation, about humans unknowingly trapped in a digital prison, about a hacker named Neo who might be the one to free them. It was philosophical, it was weird, and it required an actor who could anchor the madness with believable vulnerability. They wanted Keanu. He read the script once and knew this was something different. Not just another action movie, but a film about questioning everything, about searching for truth in a world built on lies, themes that resonated with a man who had spent his entire life searching for where he belonged. He trained for 4 months, learning wire work, mastering martial arts under Yuen Wu-ping, the legendary choreographer who had worked on some of Hong Kong's greatest action films. He learned to move like water, to fight like poetry, to make the impossible look effortless. When The Matrix opened on March 31st, 1999, it wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural phenomenon. The bullet-dodging scene became iconic. "I Know Kung Fu" became a meme before memes had a name. The film earned over $460 million worldwide and launched one of the most successful franchises in cinema history. Keanu Reeves was now more than a star. He was Neo, the One, a symbol of rebellion, of awakening, of the idea that one person could change everything. At 34 years old, he stood at the absolute peak of his career. Magazines declared him the biggest action star in the world. His face was on billboards across the globe. He could have had anything he wanted, but what Keanu wanted most, fame could never give him. He wanted a family. He wanted love that lasted. He wanted to build something that mattered more than box office numbers or critical acclaim. And in 1998, just as The Matrix was being completed, he met someone who made him believe that kind of life was finally possible. Her name was Jennifer Syme. and loving her would lead to the most devastating chapter of his life. Jennifer Syme was not an actress seeking fame or a model chasing cameras. She was a production assistant with a quiet presence, someone who understood the machinery of Hollywood but had no interest in being its product. She had worked with David Lynch, respected in her craft, content to remain behind the scenes. When she met Keanu at a party in 1998, neither expected what would follow. But there was an instant recognition, a sense that they understood each other in ways words couldn't quite capture. She saw past the movie star. He saw someone who didn't need him to be anyone other than himself. They fell in love slowly, carefully, like two people who had both been hurt before and knew how fragile happiness could be. By late 1999, as The Matrix dominated theaters and Keanu's face was everywhere, something even more profound was happening in his private life. Jennifer was pregnant. For a man who had spent his entire life in motion, always searching, never quite settling, the news felt like an anchor in the best possible way. He was going to be a father. The role he had never known how to play himself, he would finally get to define on his own terms. He later told a close friend, "I was terrified and excited in equal measure, but mostly, I just felt ready." They chose the name together, Ava Archer Syme Reeves, a name that carried hope, strength, and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine until now. Keanu pulled back from work. He turned down roles, canceled appearances, and focused entirely on preparing for fatherhood. He painted the nursery himself. He read books about parenting, about how to be present, how to give a child the stability he had never known. For the first time in decades, life felt like it was moving in the right direction. And then, on December 24th, 1999, Christmas Eve, everything shattered. Jennifer went into labor 8 months into the pregnancy. Something was wrong. The doctors moved quickly, urgently. But there are some battles medicine cannot win. After hours of labor, after Keanu held Jennifer's hand and whispered that everything would be okay, their daughter was born. Ava Archer Syme Reeves was stillborn, silent, still, gone, before she ever got to begin. The nursery Keanu had painted would never hear a baby's cry. The name they had chosen so carefully would never be called out in laughter or bedtime rituals. The future they had built in whispered conversations collapsed in a single unbearable moment. Keanu held his daughter. He held her tiny, perfect body and tried to understand how something so longed for could be stolen so completely. Jennifer, shattered by grief and the physical trauma of birth, could barely speak. They left the hospital with empty arms and a silence so heavy it felt like drowning. Friends who saw Keanu in the weeks that followed described him as a ghost. He moved through the world but wasn't truly present. His eyes, once warm, had gone distant. He didn't return calls. He didn't leave the house unless necessary. He simply existed in the wreckage, trying to breathe through pain that had no name and no end. "I don't think people understand what it's like to lose a child you never got to meet," he would confess years later, his voice breaking. "You mourn not just who they were, but everything they would have been." He and Jennifer tried to hold each other through the grief. But tragedy doesn't always bring people closer. Sometimes it pushes them apart, each person drowning in their own unbearable ocean, unable to reach across the distance. By early 2000, they had quietly separated, not out of anger or blame, but because the weight of shared sorrow had become too much to carry together. They remained in each other's lives, still caring deeply, still hoping that time might ease the ache. But time, cruel as it is, had one more blow to deliver. On April 2nd, 2001, just 18 months after Ava's death, Jennifer Syme was driving alone in Los Angeles. It was early morning. She had been at a party the night before, celebrating a friend's career milestone, trying perhaps to find a moment of normalcy in a life still shadowed by grief. Her Jeep Cherokee veered off the road on Cahuenga Boulevard, rolled multiple times, and struck a row of parked cars. She was thrown from the vehicle. By the time paramedics arrived, Jennifer Syme was dead. She was 28 years old. Keanu received the call while at home. For the second time in less than 2 years, he found himself standing in a hospital, staring at white walls, unable to process the words being spoken to him. The woman he loved, the mother of his daughter, gone. He had already buried his child. Now he had to bury the only person who truly understood that loss. The funeral was private, heartbreakingly small. Keanu stood in a black suit, his face expressionless, his grief too enormous to show. He didn't speak. He didn't cry in public. He simply stood there, a man who had lost everything that mattered in the span of 16 months. Afterward, he vanished from Hollywood almost entirely. No press, no interviews, no explanations. Those close to him worried he might never come back. "I thought we'd lost him," one friend admitted years later. "Not physically, but emotionally. He just shut down." In the years that followed, Keanu rarely spoke Jennifer's name. When asked about family or relationships, he would deflect with a sad smile and change the subject. The pain was too raw, too sacred to be dissected by strangers. But once, in a rare moment of candor, he said something that revealed the depth of his wound. Grief changes shape, but it doesn't change weight. The world saw the movie star. They saw Neo, the hero who could stop bullets. But behind the legend was a man carrying 2 coffins in his heart, grieving a daughter he never got to hold, and a love that ended too soon. And from that grief, Keanu Reeves would emerge not bitter, but softer, not broken, but reshaped. He learned that life was unbearably fragile, that love was fleeting, and that the only response to such cruelty was to be kinder than the world deserved. It would take years. It would take silence. It would take a long, lonely walk through darkness. But eventually, Keanu would find a way forward. Not by forgetting, but by carrying the weight with grace. In the months and years following Jennifer's death, Keanu Reeves became a paradox. Everywhere and nowhere at once. His face was on every movie poster for the Matrix sequels. His name dominated box office reports. But the man himself had retreated into a silence so profound that even those who worked closest to him felt they were standing beside a stranger. On set for The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions, filmed back-to-back in 2001 and 2002, crew members noticed the change immediately. The Keanu who had arrived for the first film, curious and engaged, was gone. In his place was someone who performed brilliantly, hit every mark, nailed every stunt, but then disappeared the moment cameras stopped rolling. He was professional, flawless even, one crew member recalled, but you could see he was somewhere else, somewhere we couldn't reach. Between takes, while other actors joked or checked their phones, Keanu would sit alone, staring at nothing. During lunch breaks, he often skipped meals entirely, choosing instead to walk the studio lot in silence, hands in pockets, lost in thoughts he shared with no one. The Wachowskis, protective of their star, shielded him from press as much as possible. But when interviews were unavoidable, Keanu delivered the same carefully neutral responses. He talked about the philosophy of the films, the choreography, the visual effects. He never mentioned Jennifer. He never mentioned Ava. When one journalist, unaware or uncaring, asked about his personal life, Keanu's face hardened for just a moment. "I prefer to keep that private," he said quietly. The interview ended shortly after, but while Hollywood saw only the surface, a professional actor fulfilling his obligations, something else was happening beneath. Keanu was rebuilding his understanding of what life meant and what it was worth. He began riding the Los Angeles subway, an almost unheard-of choice for a movie star of his caliber. Paparazzi photos caught him on public benches, eating a sandwich alone, feeding pieces to pigeons. The images went viral, not because they were scandalous, but because they were so ordinary, so human. "Sad Keanu," the internet labeled one particular photo. Him sitting on a bench in 2010, looking contemplative, a simple meal in his hands. The memes spread everywhere, often mocking, sometimes affectionate. But those who looked closer saw something else. Not sadness, but quiet acceptance. A man who had learned that happiness was not permanent, that loss was inevitable, and that the simplest moments, a bench, a sandwich, the sun on your face, were sometimes all you had. And then the stories began to surface. Small acts that Keanu never publicized, never sought credit for, but that slowly painted a picture of who he had become. A set builder on the Matrix sequels mentioned that Keanu had given him a bonus of thousands of dollars, saying simply, "You have a family to take care of." When the man tried to refuse, Keanu insisted, "Please, it would mean something to me." Reports emerged that he had given away approximately $75 million of his earnings from the Matrix sequels to the special effects and costume design teams. When asked why, he shrugged, "They're the reason the film looks the way it does. They deserve it." He paid for a stranger's chemotherapy after overhearing a conversation in a hospital waiting room. He bought motorcycles for stunt crews as thank you gifts. He once gave up his seat on a plane to a woman traveling with a baby, then sat on the floor in the aisle for the duration of the flight. None of these stories came from Keanu himself. They surfaced through the people he helped, shared quietly, almost in disbelief that someone so famous could be so genuinely kind. When asked in one rare interview about his philosophy on life, Keanu paused for a long time before answering. "I think we're all just trying to get through it," he finally said. "And if you can make someone's day a little easier, why wouldn't you?" But the generosity wasn't compensation for grief. It was transformation. Keanu had learned that holding on to things, money, fame, possessions, meant nothing when the people you loved could be taken in an instant. So he gave. Not to feel better, but because it was the only response to loss that made sense to him. Still, the loneliness remained. Friends tried to set him up on dates. He politely declined. When pressed about relationships, he would offer a sad smile. "I'm not really looking for that right now." Because how do you explain to someone that you're still carrying two ghosts? That every potential future feels like a betrayal of the past? That the last time you allowed yourself to hope for family, it ended in unspeakable tragedy? Keanu chose solitude not out of fear, but out of respect for what he had lost. And in that solitude, he found a different kind of strength. Not the kind that fights or conquers, but the kind that endures. The kind that wakes up every morning, despite everything, and chooses to keep going. If loss had been a singular event in Keanu's life, perhaps recovery would have been simpler. A wound that scars, but eventually heals. But grief, for him, was not a single blow. It was wave after wave, each one arriving just as he learned to breathe again. While the world mourned with him for Jennifer and Ava, few knew about the battle he had been fighting quietly for years before those tragedies ever struck. A battle that began in 1991 when his younger sister Kim was diagnosed with leukemia. Kim had always been the constant in Keanu's chaotic childhood. When their father left, when their mother moved them across continents, when schools changed and stepfathers came and went, Kim was there. She was his anchor, the only person who understood the strange, fractured landscape of their upbringing. And now, she was dying. The leukemia was aggressive. Doctors gave cautious prognoses, spoke in careful terms about treatment options and survival rates. But Keanu heard only one thing: his sister might not survive. He didn't hesitate. While filming Point Break, while his career was finally gaining momentum, Keanu spent every free moment by Kim's side. He rearranged shooting schedules. He flew back and forth between sets and hospitals. When treatments made her too weak to walk, he carried her. When the pain was unbearable, he sat with her in silence, holding her hand. He put his whole life on pause, a family friend recalled. There was no question, no hesitation. Kim came first. The battle lasted a decade. 10 years of chemotherapy, experimental treatments, hospital rooms that became more familiar than film sets. 10 years of hope and relapse, progress and setbacks, celebrations cut short by new tumors, new fears. Keanu paid for everything. Not just the treatments insurance wouldn't cover, but the best specialists, alternative therapies, anything that offered even a glimmer of hope. He sold properties. He turned down lucrative roles that would take him too far from her for too long. When asked years later about the financial cost, he looked genuinely confused by the question. "It was never about money," he said simply. "It was my sister." In 2001, the same year Jennifer died, Kim finally went into remission. Against impossible odds, she survived. But the relief Keanu felt was complicated by the fresh grief of losing Jennifer just months earlier. He had saved one person he loved and lost another. The universe, it seemed, demanded balance, and Kim's survival, miraculous as it was, couldn't erase the years of fear, the nights he had sat in hospital corridors wondering if he would lose her too. The trauma of those years stayed with him, a reminder that everyone he loved lived under the shadow of fragility. But Kim wasn't the only ghost that haunted him. River Phoenix's death in 1993 had carved a wound that never truly closed. Even years later, even after building a successful career, even after becoming one of Hollywood's biggest stars, Keanu carried River with him. He kept a photograph of River in his wallet, not for sentimentality, but as a reminder of how quickly life could end, how talent and kindness and youth were no protection against fate's cruelty. In interviews, when River's name came up, Keanu's entire demeanor would shift. The practiced smile would fade. His voice would drop. "He was extraordinary," Keanu would say, the present tense slipping to past tense mid-sentence, as if his mind still struggled to accept the permanence of loss. River had been 23. Jennifer had been 28. Ava never got to be anything. The mathematics of loss became unbearable. How do you reconcile that people you loved, people younger than you, people with whole lives ahead of them, were simply gone? How do you wake up each morning knowing that you survived when they didn't? Keanu never spoke the word survivor's guilt publicly, but those close to him saw it. The way he gave away his money, as if it were cursed. The way he avoided attachment, as if closeness itself were dangerous. The way he rode motorcycles too fast, performed stunts that terrified his insurance agents, lived as though consequences didn't matter because the worst had already happened. By the mid-2000s, Keanu Reeves had survived his father's abandonment, River's overdose, Ava's stillbirth, Jennifer's death, and a decade of fearing he would lose Kim. He had buried more people than most do in a lifetime. And yet, somehow, he kept going. Not with bitterness, not with rage, but with a quiet, almost defiant grace. The question was no longer whether Keanu could survive loss. He had proven that repeatedly. The question was, could he ever truly live again? By 2013, Keanu Reeves had become something of a Hollywood enigma. Still beloved, still respected, but no longer the box office titan he had been during the Matrix era. His recent films had underperformed. Critics questioned whether his moment had passed. He was approaching 50, an age when action heroes are typically put out to pasture. But Keanu had never cared much about what was typical. When directors Chad Stahelski and David Leitch approached him with a script called John Wick, most actors would have dismissed it as beneath them. A simple revenge thriller about a retired assassin who goes on a killing spree because someone killed his dog. On paper, it sounded like direct-to-video material. But Keanu read deeper. He saw something in John Wick that others might have missed. This wasn't just a man seeking revenge for a pet. It was a man clinging to the last piece of his dead wife, a final gift she had left him before cancer took her. The dog represented hope, the possibility of healing, the fragile thread connecting him to a future without her. When that thread was cut, John Wick didn't just seek vengeance, he sought purpose. He needed a reason to keep moving, even if that reason was destruction. Keanu understood that character in his bones. I connected with his grief, Keanu admitted years later. John had lost everything that mattered, and I knew what that felt like. He didn't just accept the role, he rebuilt himself for it. At 49 years old, Keanu trained with an intensity that shocked even seasoned stunt coordinators. He spent months in tactical firearms training, learning to reload, to shoot with precision, to move through rooms like a predator. He studied judo, jiu-jitsu, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, earning genuine respect from martial arts professionals who expected a movie star going through the motions, but found instead a student genuinely committed to mastery. He trained harder than men half his age, one instructor recalled. There was something almost obsessive about it, like he needed to prove something, not to us, but to himself. The physicality became a form of meditation. Every punch absorbed, every choreographed kill, every hour in the gym was a way to channel years of accumulated pain into something tangible. Grief had no outlet, but violence, controlled and precise, could be directed. When John Wick was released in October 2014, no one expected what happened next. The film was a phenomenon. Critics praised its balletic brutality. Audiences couldn't get enough of the mythology, the world-building, the stunning action sequences that felt more like dance than fighting. But most of all, they responded to Keanu. There was something raw in his performance, something that transcended acting. When John Wick mourned his wife, when he stared at photographs of happier days, when he fought with a desperation that felt less like action and more like survival, audiences felt it. They didn't know about Ava or Jennifer, but they sensed the truth beneath the fiction. Keanu wasn't playing grief, one critic wrote. He was channeling it. The film earned over $86 million worldwide on a $20 million budget, an enormous success for an independent action film. But more importantly, it gave Keanu something he thought he'd lost: relevance. Suddenly, at 50, he was cool again. Not in the manufactured, studio-driven way of his earlier stardom, but in an earned, authentic way. He had become the rare actor who aged into a different kind of icon. Not the invincible hero, but the scarred survivor who keeps fighting anyway. John Wick Chapter 2 arrived in 2017, expanding the mythology and doubling the box office. Chapter 3. Parabellum came in 2019, earning over $326 million globally. Each film pushed Keanu harder physically, and each time he rose to the challenge, performing stunts that would hospitalize actors half his age. He broke ribs, he tore ligaments, he trained until his body screamed for rest, and then trained more. When asked why he pushed himself so hard, his answer was simple: because I can still do it. And that matters. The subtext was clear to anyone paying attention. After losing so much, after having so many things taken from him that he couldn't control, the ability to master his own body, to push past limits, to prove that he was still capable, was everything. But the rebirth wasn't just professional. Something else was shifting. In interviews during the John Wick years, Keanu began to smile more. Not the practiced Hollywood smile, but genuine laughter. He joked with talk show hosts. He surprised fans at screenings. He signed autographs for hours, never rushing, always present. The internet, which had once made him a meme of sadness, now celebrated him as the internet's boyfriend, a man so universally beloved that even cynical corners of social media couldn't find fault with him. Stories continued to surface. He donated his John Wick back-end profits to the stunt and costume teams. He bought the entire crew Rolex watches after filming Wrapped. He stopped traffic to help a stranded motorist change a tire. "He just seems genuinely happy now," a co-star observed. "Like he's made peace with something." And perhaps he had. Not by forgetting his losses, but by transforming them. John Wick was a character defined by grief, who found purpose in action. Keanu was a man defined by tragedy, who found purpose in kindness. The parallel was impossible to miss. By the time John Wick Chapter 4 was released in 2023, Keanu Reeves was not just a movie star. He was a symbol of resilience, of humility, of the idea that you could survive the unsurvivable and still choose to be good. The man who had once been invisible, abandoned, and broken had become unforgettable, not despite his scars, but because of them. In 2019, something unexpected happened. Keanu Reeves, the man who had avoided romantic relationships for nearly 2 decades, appeared on a red carpet holding hands with artist Alexandra Grant. The internet exploded, not with scandal, but with genuine joy. Alexandra was not a starlet or a model. She was an accomplished visual artist, a thoughtful intellectual, someone who had known Keanu for years as a friend and collaborator before anything romantic developed. They had worked together on his books, Ode to Happiness and Shadows, art projects that explored themes of mortality, impermanence, and finding light in darkness. When asked about their relationship, Keanu's response was characteristically understated but revealing. "It's beautiful to have a partner in life." For a man who had once said he didn't think he'd ever have that kind of connection again, the admission carried profound weight. He wasn't rushing into marriage or making grand declarations. He was simply, quietly, allowing himself to be happy again. Those close to him noticed the difference immediately. There was a lightness to Keanu that hadn't been there before. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of something new. Hope. Alexandra understands him, a mutual friend observed. She knows his history, She respects his privacy, and she doesn't need him to be anything other than who he is. That's rare. But even as personal happiness returned, Keanu's philosophy remained unchanged. The generosity that had defined his response to loss continued to define his success. In 2011, he had quietly founded a private cancer foundation, funding research and providing financial assistance to patients who couldn't afford treatment. He never attached his name to it. When a journalist finally uncovered the connection years later, Keanu refused to discuss it publicly. "Some things don't need to be talked about," was all he would say. He continued giving away vast portions of his earnings. On the Matrix Resurrections in 2021, he reportedly gave millions to the crew, focusing especially on those in below-the-line positions: electricians, costume designers, set builders, the people Hollywood typically overlooks. "He knows everyone's name," a grip recalled. "And I mean everyone. He'll remember your birthday, ask about your kids. He treats the person holding a boom mic with the same respect he gives the director." His motorcycle company, Arch Motorcycle, founded with custom bike builder Gard Hollinger, became another passion project. Not a vanity brand, but a legitimate craftsmanship endeavor where Keanu worked alongside engineers, testing bikes, refining designs, genuinely invested in creating something of quality. "He doesn't just put his name on it," Hollinger explained. "He's in the shop, covered in grease, testing every prototype." This isn't a celebrity hobby. It's real. And perhaps most tellingly, Keanu's views on death, shaped by decades of loss, evolved into something almost philosophical. In a viral interview clip, he was asked, "What do you think happens when we die?" He paused, thoughtful as always, then answered, "I know that the ones who love us will miss us." The response, simple and devastatingly beautiful, revealed everything about how loss had shaped him. Not with fear of death, but with awareness of absence. Not with existential dread, but with compassion for those left behind. By 2024, at 60 years old, Keanu Reeves has become something unprecedented in Hollywood. A legend without scandal, a star without ego, a wealthy man who lives modestly and gives extravagantly. He still rides the subway when in New York. He still signs autographs until the last fan is satisfied. He still performs stunts that insurance companies beg him to let doubles handle. When asked about retirement, he laughs. "Retire to what? This is what I love." But this has expanded beyond acting. He's developing comic books through his company BRZRKR. He's producing films. He's mentoring young actors, offering the guidance he never received. And through it all, he remains almost pathologically humble. At the 2023 premiere of John Wick Chapter 4, a fan shouted, "You're breathtaking," echoing a moment from a 2019 video game conference where Keanu had turned the compliment back on an audience member. Without missing a beat, Keanu pointed back and said, "You're breathtaking." It was a small moment, but it captured everything. Keanu Reeves, at the height of his resurgence, at an age when most action stars have long since faded, still deflects praise, still centers others, still refuses to see himself the way the world sees him. His homes are modest by Hollywood standards. He doesn't own a yacht. His clothing is simple: jeans, boots, a black t-shirt. He's been photographed wearing the same jacket for over a decade. When questioned about his lifestyle choices, his answer is always some variation of the same theme. "I have everything I need." And perhaps that's the ultimate legacy. Not the films, though they'll endure. Not the box office records or the iconic roles. But the example of a man who lost almost everything, survived, and chose not to become bitter or guarded, but to become more open, more generous, more present. He turned grief into empathy. He turned isolation into connection. He turned loss into a philosophy of living fully in whatever time remains. In a culture obsessed with accumulation, Keanu gives away. In an industry built on ego, he practices humility. In a world that often rewards cruelty, he chooses relentless, almost stubborn kindness. "I've been very lucky," he said recently, a statement that would seem absurd coming from anyone who knows his story. But Keanu Reeves believes it, because he's still here, because he found love again, because his sister survived, because he gets to make movies and ride motorcycles and help people in ways both grand and invisible. Lucky. After everything. Lucky. And perhaps that perspective, forged in unimaginable fire, is the greatest gift his story offers. The reminder that survival itself, with grace intact, is a victory worth celebrating. And so we return to where we began. Keanu Reeves, the man the world knows as Neo, as John Wick, as the action hero who defies age and gravity. But now you know the truth beneath the legend. You know about the father who abandoned him before memory could form. The childhood spent searching for a home that never quite materialized. The best friend who died on a sidewalk at 23. The daughter he held but never heard cry. The woman he loved, taken in a flash of metal and asphalt. The sister he nearly lost to a decade-long battle with death. You know that the man who makes giving away millions look effortless is the same man who once had nothing. That the actor who treats crew members like family is the man who spent his childhood invisible. That the star who rides the subway and shares his lunch with strangers understands, more than most, how fragile and precious ordinary moments truly are. Keanu Reeves did not become kind because life was kind to him. He became kind because life was cruel, and he chose a different response than bitterness. He did not become generous because he had excess. He became generous because he learned that holding on to anything, money, fame, even people, is an illusion. Everything can be taken. Everything will end. The only choice that matters is how you move through the world while you're still here. At 60, Keanu stands as proof that survival is not the same as victory. But it can be. That losing everything does not mean you've lost your capacity to give. That grief, when carried with grace rather than rage, can transform into something that looks remarkably like wisdom. He is not perfect. He has made mistakes, loved imperfectly, struggled in ways we will never fully know. But he is profoundly, undeniably human. And in a world starved for authenticity, that humanity has become his greatest role. The boy who was abandoned learned to show up for others. The man who buried his child became the person who fights to protect other people's families. The actor who could have isolated in mansions chooses park benches and public transit. If Keanu Reeves has taught us anything, it is this: that tragedy does not have to define you, but it can refine you. That the kindest people are often those who have suffered the most. And that legacy is not built in what you take from the world, but in what you leave behind. Subscribe to honor more untold stories. Share this if Keanu's journey moved you. Leave a comment about which moment struck you deepest. Because in every subway ride, in every anonymous donation, in every autograph signed with patience, Keanu Reeves whispers the same truth. We are all just walking each other home. And some of us, despite everything, choose to make that walk a little easier for others. That is the legacy of Keanu Reeves. Not invincibility, but unbreakable kindness. Not fame, but grace.